Hello, everyone. I'm Erik Brynjolfsson, and today we're going to have another digital economy lunch. Our speaker will be Laura Veldkamp. She's a professor of finance at Columbia University's Graduate School of Business and a former editor of the Journal of Economic Theory. She earned her PhD right here at Stanford in the Stanford Graduate School of Business. She's also a research fellow at the NBER and the Center for Economic Policy Research, and a frequent consultant to the New York and Minneapolis Federal Reserve Banks, and author of a textbook, Information Choice in Macroeconomics and Finance. Today, Laura is going to be speaking to us about data and market power. Thank you so much for joining us, Laura. It's all yours.
Great. Thank you, Erik. Great. Can you see my slides? Give me a thumbs up. Great. And I'm moving. Okay, great. This is joint work with Jan Eekhout, who's at Pompeo Fabra. Thanks for being here today. So starting point is, we know data has economies of scale. Big firms seem to benefit more. So my apologies, there are probably a few of you on this call who are in the end company in this citation, but Erik's work is clearly the string, the thread that ties lots of insights in this literature together. But one thing we've learned from his work is that this isn't just about the big five firms, right? I'm not really here to talk to you about data platforms today. That's an interesting discussion to have, but it's separate from how regular product firms are doing data-driven decision-making, and data is helping them to be more productive. And the question then arises, given that still big firms seem to benefit more, is this a source of market power, right? Anytime the largest firms in the economy are benefiting, we might raise some concerns. So the way economists often look at market power is to ask about markups. What is the price relative to the cost of production? And so here the literature is split. There are economists who argue that market-wide markups are rising, and this suggests rising market power. They also find those markups to be counter-cyclical. And yet there are other people who say, no, the markups look more stable, and those economists tend to measure markups at the product level. So there's some disagreement about what's actually happening right now to market power, never mind what its cause is. So our question is, if data-intensive firms grow bigger, how should that affect markups? If this is becoming a more predominant phenomenon, then what should we even expect to see? And are markups even a good measure of what might be going on with market power? And also, can data help us make sense of this conflicting evidence? So there'll be two key themes of today's talk. The first is there are competing effects of data on markups. Data will lower risk, and that will be a force pushing markups down, but also raise the market share of the largest firms in the economy, and that will push the market markups up. And second, data really creates markups that increase at higher levels of aggregation. So this simple theory is going to tell us about why the nitty-gritty details of exactly how we're measuring this key measure of market power, these markups, why that measurement technique might matter a lot. So here's an outline of what I'll do. Today's a short talk, so I'll keep it brief. Data is information. That's my starting point, right? A data point is a digitized bit of information, and information at its essence is a technology to resolve uncertainty. That's what it does. It resolves our risk. It allows us to forecast things better and thereby be less uncertain about what's going to happen in the future. So we're going to model this as uncertain consumer demand for a variety of products. A firm doesn't know how much will people like Erik's white shirt as opposed to my blue shirt, right? And how much will they be willing to pay for, his bright white shirt as opposed to my blue shirt? Maybe his shirt's really cool today. And they're going to try to be figuring this out and thereby decide what to produce, right? And if they get it right, they're going to make more money. They're going to be more profitable. So in doing this, they're facing uncertainty. They're facing risk, revenue risk. And a key assumption here is that firms price this risk. So for those of you joining us from the world of finance, this seems like an obvious statement, right? Almost every finance class in a business school teaches students to price risk in one way or another. But from the point of view of somebody coming from the field of industrial organization, this is a pretty unusual assumption to put in a model. And I'll show you why it's really important. But the essence of it is, if we think information is there to resolve risk, we ought to think about people who care about that risk. So firms here are going to choose an upfront investment, and then they're going to choose how much to produce. So this upfront investment is something like, how big a factory do I want to build? If I build a really big high-tech factory, I can produce at low marginal cost. So data will have these competing effects. That's theme number one. And these competing effects come from, first, growing big is risky, right? Building that big factory to produce at low marginal costs involves this big upfront expenditure. High data firms are going to be more willing to do this. They're going to be more willing to incur that risk because they can use data to forecast what the future demand for that product will be. And so by growing bigger, they're going to push markups up, right? Big firms with lots of market power is going to show up as a higher markup here. But second, producing many units is also risky, right? Even once you have that firm in place, deciding to go ahead and produce lots of Eric's bright white shirts is still a risk they have to take. And so when data allows firms to predict demand for those white shirts well, they're going to do more of it, and more output will lower the price. So we'll call this a risk premium effect. The composition effects arise because firms use data to produce more profitable, meaning more high markup goods, right? That's why they value the data. They want to use the data to do the right thing, meaning the more profitable thing, the more high markup good. And so it's going to create a composition effect. It's going to skew their production towards goods that are higher in markups. And that production will be more skewed the more data they have. And then we'll look at pro-cyclical and counter-cyclical markups and see how that might vary with data as well. Okay. So this is really a toy model. It's meant to explore a few simple ideas, and it's not one with all of the realistic or relevant assumptions in place. So we're going to start with NF firms. So this is a finite number of firms. This is not a perfectly competitive market with an infinite number of firms that have no effect on their marketplace, right? This is imperfect competition. There's going to be a product space that has n attributes, right? So an attribute might be white or blue, or an attribute might be, is it a shirt or is it a sweater, right? And so each good will be a bundle of attributes, and those attributes will be indexed by J. So goods, we'll denote a particular good by K, is a combination of attributes, and a good has weights on attributes AJK, right? So if the attribute is white, Eric's shirt has a loading on that attribute, maybe of 1. My shirt, which is blue, does not load on the white attribute. So I would have a loading of 0 on that attribute. Firms are going to choose an investment to lower their marginal cost. Lowering the marginal cost will have a price, G. That G depends on this parameter that we call chi-C. That's just there so that later we can say, well, what if that price is really high? What if it costs a lot to build this factory? What if it's cheaper? But it, of course, depends on the marginal cost itself, right? And building a bigger factory to produce very cheaply is going to require a more expensive upfront investment. And then they're going to choose a quantity to produce. So with your factory in place, now you say, okay, how many white shirts, how many blue shirts, how many sweaters, how many socks do I want to produce? And they're going to do that to maximize this objective. We'll call UI for firm I. So what's this objective? Well, firms like more expected profits. Pi here is profits. So profits are the quantity of each of the goods they produce times the price minus the marginal cost. So this quantity is a vector. It's a number of each good. So like the first entry in the vector might be how many white shirts. The second in the entry in the vector might be how many blue shirts. The third entry could be how many socks, and so forth, for all the goods in the economy. And so similarly, each of these goods has a price. And this is the marginal cost of the attribute CI. And that A is the matrix of all of these AJKs, right? So the JK entry of capital A is this weight AJK. So this A matrix tells us how to map marginal costs of attributes into marginal costs of goods. Okay, so this is basically saying how much do you produce and how much do you profit per unit. Add all that stuff up, that's the firm's profits. Firms like more profits. What they dislike is variance of profits, right? So this is the variance of that profit. It's conditional on the data that they have, right? That's what that bar is. Every variance is conditional on some information set. So this is like, if they were going to try to forecast that, what would be their expected squared forecast errors? What would be their sum of squared residuals if they were running a regression? This is the price of risk that firm faces. So this is how much they dislike risk. We're going to divide it by 2. That's just a normalization. And then, of course, the firm loses profits if it has to pay a lot for its upfront investment. And this was that investment cost we described. So rho I here is firm's price of risk. Now, there's an interesting discussion to be had here about exactly why firms price this risk and why they price this kind of risk. Today's a short talk. I'm just going to say that firms care about that, but I'd be happy to talk about that more in the Q&A.
So just to be clear, the risk is not that it's not coming from the production function directly, like that there's any cost of trying to change your production if you don't match up. This is holding constant some production.
You're going to choose your production function up front. That's this. That's a choice that has a risky revenue consequence. I know how much it costs to build that, and I know that if I build this factory, I'll be able to produce at this marginal cost CI, but I don't know how much I'll gain from that. Now, you raise an interesting question, which is, it could be that firms are uncertain about marginal costs, right? And that certainly happens in the real world. We decided to make the uncertainty about the price because markups are price divided by marginal cost. And whenever you put random variables in the denominator of a fraction, things get pretty ugly pretty quickly, right? So if you said, I've got a whole bunch of facts about inverse marginal costs, which would put costs on top and prices on the bottom, I would write you a theory about firms that are uncertain about costs and know what the prices are. But given that we measure it this way, this was the more convenient approach for thinking about markups.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
So here's demand. Customers' willingness to pay, that's this V tilde, and this is their willingness to pay for an attribute, is going to decrease in the quantity that firms produce of that attribute. Right? So if the market is flooded with white clothing, then you can't charge as much for white clothing as if white clothing were really scarce. And then
so just really one other question. I may have missed this, but what's the timing? This all happens in one period?
Yes, this is a static model. Okay. So they're going to build the factory, they're going to choose how much to produce, and they're going to get some revenue from it. Okay. Now we could repeat that again next period, but there's nothing here linking one period to another. So we're just going to take a snapshot in. So the willingness to pay depends on a parameter, P lower bar. That's just how much people tend to like white versus blue. It depends on a random component. This is what they're going to use data to try to forecast. And it depends on how much other firms are producing of this good. So if other firms are producing a lot, the willingness to pay is going to be lower. The market is flooded with this good, it's going to be cheap. So the demand shock for attributes, BI, is a normal variable. It's got mean 0. If it had some positive mean, I'd throw that in the constant P bar. It's got a variance matrix. It's the identity matrix, so it's 1. And it's IID across firms. And note here that the phi here is the price elasticity of demand. It's going to say, how sensitive is my price, my willingness to pay, to the amount that other firms produce, or the total amount produced in the market. So then this is about how customers value an attribute, blue or white or sweater or sock, and their value of a good is simply a linear in the attributes. So if I value the attribute this much, this V tilde J, and the loading of good K on that attribute is AJK, then my value for good K is simply the sum of all the attributes and the number of units of them. Okay, so goods or portfolios of attributes. So data is information about these demand shocks, these BIs. So a firm, I'm going to assume, has NDI data points. There's an interesting question about where these come from, how they produce them, do they buy them, and so forth. That's not my focus today. I've thought long and hard about that in other projects. But today I want to say, what effect does more data have? And if I'm interested in the effect of data, I'm going to take data as given and say, well, what if they have more? What if they have less? And what does that do? So I'm taking data as given here. So firm I has NDI data points, and that's independent across, these data points will be independent across firms. Each data point is SIZ. Z is the index for the particular data point we're thinking about. So data point 1 or 2 or 3. Each of them is about BI, the vector of demand shocks for all these different attributes. And it's got some noise in it, right? Data point isn't perfect, doesn't reveal the truth. It gives us some noisy information about the truth. And this noise is normal 0 signal. So a firm's information set is comprised of NDI signals. So we're going to take this index for a particular data point and run it from 1 to NDI. That's how many signals they have. And they can see the signals of all the other firms. Okay? And we can come back to this. I'm happy to talk about why we made that assumption. This is not so realistic, but it's going to allow the model to be simple and allow us to focus on some easy to derive and understand effects that are going on. if you want to put differently, this model is not about information asymmetry. It's about having more or less uncertainty, more or less data. If we add back asymmetry, the same properties hold, but there'll be other interesting effects as well.
I'm not sure I'm following. What's the difference between the data that one firm has versus the data another firm has? Is everybody just observing all the data?
Everybody's observing all the data, but these attributes, these shocks are firm specific. So my data is about demand for the kinds of shirts that I produce. Your data is about the kind of shirts your firm produces, and these have nothing to do with each other in this model.
Okay, I mean, I guess it's sort of terminology, but I don't have different data than you have. We all have the same data, right? But so I care about the data that pertains to my products, and you care about the data that pertains to your products.
Right.
But we all see the same data.
We can all see everybody's data. We all have the same information set, but you really only care about the data. I'm calling your data.
Well, I care about, if I'm understanding, I care about your data too, because it's going to affect the demand, right?
Not for your product. We can write down that model you're describing. That's a more realistic model. It's a little bit more complicated, and I can come back and tell you exactly where that matters. But for right now,
okay. So, but the customers,
your product and my product, and they have firm specific demand shocks.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, got it. And in terms of the one more thing, so the data is independent across firms. Right. Right. So this a little bit more what that means.
The BI, this is for firm I, is independent across firms, right? This is IID across firms, and also the signal noise. So if I've got noise in my data points, that's not correlated with the noise in your data points. Okay, got it. Okay. So all of this stuff can be relaxed, but it's going to make things look messier and harder to interpret. Okay, so a first order condition describes what the firm's optimal choice is. So here, production. So actually, now there are a few questions in Q&A. I think they're relevant to the slide, so I'll bring them up. Sure. Steve Tadelis asks, in this sort of like what we were just going, why not have every firm just observe their own data if they don't care about the other firm's data? Yeah, it doesn't. I'm not trying to forecast. I'm eliminating strategic uncertainty. The reason that I allow Erik to see my data set is because then my actions are not going to be uncertain to Erik, and he doesn't have to forecast them as well. But do your actions simplify things a little bit? Do your actions affect my demand or anything? Yes. They do. Yes. Right. This is basically a Cournot structure, right? Okay. So if I produce more of goods with the white attribute, it affects the price you'll get. Got it. Okay. So we do care about that. Okay. But the bite of this assumption is that there isn't strategic uncertainty. I'm not trying to figure out what you know and what you do. I'm just trying to forecast how much demand will be for my product. Everything else here, I'm well aware. Okay. Got it. Okay. Great. And I think strategic uncertainty is an interesting aspect of this problem. It's not going to change so we have a version of the model that has that strategic uncertainty. It's solved in the appendix. It's not going to change the qualitative nature of the predictions I'm going to give you, but it's going to introduce some additional effects on top of it. Right. Makes sense to start with this model, and you can extend it in lots of different ways. Exactly. The goal is to try to write down the simplest model that captures these relevant effects. So production here depends on risk and on price impact. So let me start with, so this is the optimal number of units you produce of each of the goods. This thing is a vector, and it depends on the expected price of each of those goods and its marginal cost. And then we're going to divide that by the price of risk times the conditional variance. How uncertain am I about those demand shocks, or how uncertain am I really about the price? And dPdQ. That's if I change my quantity choice, how much does that affect price? So this thing really encapsulates the traditional notion of market power. How much do my choices, if I'm a monopolist, I'm going to try to reduce quantity a lot to try to raise that price and gain a lot of monopoly rents. But notice that risk acts a lot like monopoly power here. These two things are substitutes. They're additive. That's going to be important, and we'll come back to that. So I'm going to define a sensitivity of production to a change in the expected price it's just this first term here, right? Here's our expected price. How much does that affect quantity? Well, that's getting multiplied by this first term. So that's what I'm going to call HI, right? It's that sum of risk and market power inverse. And H bar will simply be the sum of all firms' HIs. So notice here what data does. The role of data is to lower uncertainty. It reduces the conditional variance of that price. It also will change the expected price, but it might move it up, it might move it down. On average, it does nothing to it, right? But it's going to systematically reduce my uncertainty. And so by reducing this, it's going to push up HI, right? Because of that inverse there. So notice that HI governs the covariance between quantities and prices. So what data allows a firm to do is it allows it to choose quantities that covary more precisely with their prices, okay? And that's important. So data raises the price quantity covariance. That's essential to thinking about this composition effect that I'll talk about in a moment.
Or in other words, you produce more of the things that are more valuable, and
exactly.
Data helps you know what those are.
Exactly, right? That's why firms value data. It helps them produce the right shirts or the right socks at the right time that will earn them the most profit.
But just to be clear, this doesn't take into account, there's no strategic interaction, but I guess it does take into account the fact that if it makes another company's sales more valuable, that could affect your demand as well?
Yes, so I know what my competitors will do, how much they produce affects my equilibrium price, and all of that reasoning is already baked in here. But what I've ruled out is I'm not uncertain about what you're going to do.
Right.
Okay? I know how what I do affects you and how what you do affects me, and I take all of that into account, but I'm not surprised by it.
Right.
Okay. So the optimal choice of a firm, this is this firm size, this initial investment, basically balances marginal benefit and marginal cost. Let me start with marginal cost. Well, this was our cost function, the derivative with respect to the cost of production. That's the marginal cost of building a bigger factory. What's the marginal benefit of building a bigger factory? Well, it depends on how much I expect to earn or profit on each of these units, but notice that H is in here, right? So data is going to affect H, and it's going to be boosting the marginal benefit of having a larger firm that produces more efficiently. So this is what the product level markup looks like for a firm. Let me first define what a markup is. It's the expected price of a good divided by the marginal cost of producing that good. That's our definition of the product level markup. So this is the expression.
Laura, there's a couple of questions that pertain to maybe mostly your previous slides. So I think they're pretty straightforward for you to answer. So one is, how broadly should we think about these attributes? You talked about different shirt colors, but Sam Cockenheimer asked, would it make sense to think about a car manufacturer trying to use this to determine whether to invest in EV production? Could you broaden it? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Right. Is a car electric or gas fueled? That would be an attribute.
And so they may start up a whole new division or something and have some cost.
Trying to forecast the path of future consumer demand for electric cars, given what all your competitors are likely to do in the electric car space.
And Ian Unal asks, not all data are reliable. So how would you model the uncertainty in the data collected?
So think about more data here really means more quality of data, right? I don't know how to distinguish quantity and quality. So we could think of NDI as being quality units. Having more data points of lower quality is equivalent to having fewer data points of higher quality. The uncertainty about the quality, that's not captured here. That's a separate issue, and that's much trickier to model. I think, at some level, I would think of that as less data because I would think of this as a, additional uncertainty, right, that the firm faces. But that's a pretty rough cut at a much more complicated question. So rather than talk you through this equation, let me use it to ask what makes product markups large. The first thing is having lots of valuable attributes. So what does that mean? Having big loadings, that's this AK, that loads on vectors with loads on attributes with high expected value. That's kind of what this thing is capturing. Does my product load a lot on an attribute that has a really big P lower bar, meaning that people are willing to pay a lot for that attribute, they really value it. If I do that, I get to charge higher markups, produce stuff people like. Second is low price elasticity of demand. So that's this fee thing. So fee shows up here. If that's low, this is inverted, markups go high. but it also shows up through H hat and H bar. Those are those sensitivities of quantities to expected prices. So the second term here is roughly negative H over 1 plus H, which should help you understand why the markup is decreasing in H. So if this makes H low, it's going to push up the markup. Basically, there's the price elasticity is affecting the sensitivity of firms, their willingness to produce more when they think that prices will be high. So obviously, if your customers really want your product no matter what, and they're not very price sensitive, you're going to charge a big markup. You're going to raise your price. And third is scarce data or a high price of risk. These two things enter multiplicatively. Remember that where data entered was it made these H's low, right? It pushed down the variance. If you have scarce data, you'd have higher variance and you'd have a lower H, and that would generate a higher markup. Okay? So we can see data entering here in the markup expression.
So, I mean, a key thing here is that the more confidence leads you to have less price elasticity. How sensitive is that to the assumption that the demands are independent, right? So, if is it being driven by that you're you have a unique product and shock that so less uncertainty makes you more confident and able to charge higher prices?
No, it doesn't have to do with independence. We could rewrite this as a correlated system. So first, let me say more confidence means lower variance. That's actually going to raise your quantity sensitivity to the expected price. So it's going to make you produce a lot more when you think that the price or the demand is a little bit higher. This is coming about because firms here are averse to risk. Producing more is risky, right? I don't know how much revenue I'm going to get for it. My markup includes a risk premium. I'm only going to produce units to the extent that the markup, the profit I get, compensates me for the risk that I'm bearing. But if the data allows me to resolve some of that risk, I don't demand as high a risk premium for to be willing to produce, right? Or put differently, generally this term's positive, right? We usually have prices that are greater than marginal costs. And so if this term gets bigger, I'm going to produce more units. That's pushing the price down, right? And that's what's pushing markups down.
Okay, thanks.
So you can think of it as greater scale of production or lower demand for a risk premium. Those are equivalent ways of thinking about this. Okay, so what does data do to the markup? What can we say systematically? Well, the first effect is data investment complementarity. So a firm with more data chooses a lower marginal cost C. They build the bigger factory, more modern factory that allows them to produce more. That entails a higher cost investment. So why is that happening? Well, I kind of showed you, right? More data lowers this variance. It raises H, a higher quantity sensitivity to price or larger expected scale of production makes building that big expensive factory more valuable. And then higher investment raises product markups. Right? More investment lowers that marginal cost. Look at what the markup is. Expected price divided by marginal cost. If I lower that C, markup's going up. That's almost mechanical, but not quite, because of course, when I choose a different size factory, I'm also going to affect the equilibrium price. So the point here is that lowering the cost might push the price down, but not by as much as the cost goes down. And that's exactly what you see here. When we focus on this investment channel, when there are more signals, we get a higher markup. So more data does cause firms in this world to charge a higher markup, but the expected price is falling. It's just that the expected marginal cost is falling by more. And so the markup goes up because the firm is getting much more efficient at producing goods and is passing some, but not all of that savings onto its customers. But that's not the only effect going on here. For an investment cost chi-C sufficiently high, that basically means I'm not going to let the firm adjust the size of the factory too much, right? I'm going to make it really expensive to do that. So I don't do much of the first effect. I'm kind of shutting down effect number one. Now an increase in any firm's data about any attribute of a good reduces the markup of the good. So in the previous graph, when I had more signals, the markup went up because that's when I was just focusing on the investment effect. Here, the markup goes down. That's the risk premium effect. The more data I have, the more willing I am to produce a lot. I don't need as much compensation for risk. That reduces expected prices. It doesn't change the marginal cost. Why? Because by assumption, I basically told the firm, you're not allowed to change your marginal cost very much. So we've got these two forces going in opposite directions, and it raises the natural question of who wins. Want to ask a question, Eric?
Yeah, I kind of do. So
Yeah.
this is assuming symmetry in the marginal cost. Some arguments, like Halvary and others have argued that a big part of the difference in margins is that some firms have lower marginal costs than others, and that's what's driving the margins.
You're one slide ahead of me. Give me a second to come back to asymmetry, and I'll get there. Absolutely, but I'm glad you pointed that out. All of these are statements, all of these results. Well, the propositions still hold, but the pictures I'm showing you are all about what's happening to symmetric firms. So let me first deal with what happens with one firm. So what's the net effect, right? There's this one force saying more data pushes markups up. The other one says it pushes it down. Which one wins? Well, data increases markups when the risk price is really high, right? Because then that risk channel is going to dominate. Remember, variance was multiplied by a risk price. So if this firm cares a lot about risk, we're likely to see data bring markups down. But if the marginal cost of investment is sufficiently low, then we should see, if the marginal cost of investment if it becomes cheap to adjust the size of the factory, then we're going to see this effect dominating. So it's about how flexibly can this firm adjust its production technology, which is what makes data increase markups, relative to how much does it care about the risk that it bears. Okay, so symmetric data. Symmetric data here looks great. Everything I've said paints an incredibly rosy picture of what firms do with data. It looks really innocuous. Even in the cases where they're choosing higher markups, the prices are going down, and so customers are benefiting. And so we can prove that when the number of data points is symmetric, which is what leads these firms to choose factory sizes that are symmetric, more data points will always increase social welfare. Now, there is a caveat here, which is that abundant data actually makes market power more costly. So what's going on here? This is, this red line is what is the welfare, and we can see that going up with more data points, more signals. But what would be welfare if we didn't have market power? That's this blue line, right? If I shut down, what do I mean by market power? I mean setting this DPDQ term to zero, making firms behave as if they didn't themselves have any effect on the prices they face. So if that term were in this counterfactual world where they didn't have any market power, if that term were zero, we would get welfare equal to this blue line. So we'd be better off, right? Firms exerting market power is bad. Notice that the difference between these two is the cost of market power, and it's much larger when firms have abundant data. Why is that? Well, look at how these two things enter. There's market power, there's data, they're additive. If there's abundant data, this term goes towards zero. And now welfare is this whole H term becomes very sensitive, right? If this is 1 versus 2, we've got 1 over 1 or 1/2, right? But if this thing is really big because this firm's data scarce, that variance is large, let's say that's 100. Well, the difference between 1 over 101 versus 1 over 102, that's pretty small, right? So that's the effect of market power becoming larger when data is abundant, when that variance is really, that first term is close to zero. Now, what if there's data asymmetry? That gets a lot more nuanced, and we certainly do not get that more data always improves welfare. But then again, it depends on which dominates, the risk term or the investment term for the dominant firm in the marketplace. Okay, so we'll get different results even when there's data asymmetry. It could be welfare enhancing, it could be welfare decreasing, and it depends a lot on the price of risk relative to the ability to adjust production technology.
So on this chart, they're all the lines are going upward, aren't they?
They are, yeah. So this is symmetry.
Oh, this is symmetry.
Data symmetry.
Still symmetry.
Right. I'm not showing you all the plots with data asymmetry. When we do data asymmetry, we can get some ups and downs, some downs and ups, and all kinds of things can happen. Right? But the key there, which kind of shape you get, depends a lot on price of risk and ability to adjust investment, just like the markup results did. Okay, so firm level markup is, so we've been talking about product markups, right? For a good, what is its price relative to its marginal cost? Now I want to think about a firm level markup. And that's the total revenue of the firm, price times quantity, divided by the total cost of that firm, the quantity times the marginal cost, right? This is that firm's cost. So this is the expectation of a product. We can write this as the product of expectations plus a covariance. This TR is trace because this covariance is actually a matrix because these things are vectors, but basically we're adding the covariance. Remember what I told you earlier, the role of data is to increase the covariance of the price and the quantity, right? Firms use data to produce more of stuff that's profitable. That makes this covariance term increasing in data. So what data is going to do is push up this covariance and make this firm level markup high relative to the product markups. So firms use data to create an aggregation effect. That's the point for them. Figure out which goods are more profitable and produce more of them. But that aggregation effect, that fact that it's the high markup, high price goods that they produce more of, is exactly what makes the markup of the firm large relative to the average markup of the average product the firm produces. So data creates a wedge between product and firm markups. So for a high chi-C, so I'm not going to let the firm adjust its firm size too much, an increase in firm I's data about any attribute of the good it produces increases the expected firm markup relative to the average markup of the products the firm produces. So this is what this looks like. More data, the product markup could be going down, and still we could get a firm level markup that's going up. Now, it could be, I showed you that data could make product markups go up. That's fine. Maybe both of these lines are rotated upwards and the product markup is going up. In that case, the firm markup will be going up even more. It could be that both of these lines are decreasing, but the key is the gap between the two is growing. So the firm product markup gap is a measure of a firm's data. So if you're used to thinking about the finance world, a firm here is like an investor investing in a risky portfolio of assets. We often use the difference between the return on the portfolio, that's like the firm's markup, and the return on the assets the manager holds, that's kind of like the average product level markup, as a measure of the investor's skill or the amount of information that they have. We're doing a similar sort of measurement technique here, thinking about firms' data. So don't look at markups to infer whether a firm has lots of data or not. May go up, may go down. You want to look at the difference between the markup on the goods and averaged across all those goods and the markup of the firm, which is a weighted average that weights the firms, the goods they produce more of by more.
And it sounds like you're saying that's robust to all the different variations of ways you could have symmetry and asymmetry, et cetera, that there's always a,
that's right.
I guess as long as you have multi-product firms, I mean, I guess you have to have at least multi.
Yeah, you have to have at least a couple of products.
Yeah,
that's true. But it doesn't depend on whether there's data asymmetry or not. This is a statement about what one firm. And one way to think about why this is robust to a lot of different sort of data configurations is a firm cannot systematically produce more of goods that are going to be high price unless they know what the price is going to be. Like that's not a feasible strategy otherwise, no matter what anybody else knows. I'd love as an investor or as a firm to be able to systematically buy or produce stuff that's going to be really profitable. So
is it also going to increase the gap between firms, that some firms now are lucky and are able to, they got the ones that are in high demand?
That's what this slide is. This is going to be the gap. This is going to tell you that,
okay, great.
That the industry markup, we're going to add up all over the firms. What is the quantity times price, so the revenue of each of these firms? That's for all the firms in the industry. This is the total cost of all of these firms for all the firms in the industry. This is a weighted sum of the firm markups where the weights here are cost weights. Sometimes we could weight them by sales too. It's a little bit harder to work with, but we'll get similar sorts of effects. High data firms, remember, they choose to be bigger. That was the data investment complementarity. High data firms also have higher firm markups. That was the previous result. The combination of these two is that we weight these high data firms more because they're bigger, and they're systematically the ones that have larger markups. So when we look at the industry markup, we're again got another aggregation effect going on. So data creates a wedge between the firm and the cost weighted industry markup. So again, for a high chi-C, I'm not going to let the firm adjust its size too much. An increase in firmized data about any product attribute increases the industry-wide markup relative to the average markup of the firm in that industry. Okay, so I take a firm, I increase its data, and we're going to get a bigger wedge between the industry and the firm because the high data firm is going to grow even bigger and get a higher firm markup. So you might get something that looks like this. Just like before, all three of these lines could be going up. All three of these lines could be going down. They could split like this, but they're going to be these gaps that open up between them. Here's the industry markup, here's the firm markup, and here's the product markup. And data is making these things diverge. Okay, so product to firm, this gap happens because high data firms produce more high markup products. So the firm markup could be going up, even if each one of these goods markups is going down, because we're weighting more those products that have the higher markups. And the firm to industry happens because the high data, high markup firms produce more. That's that gap.
I see how the industry would have a higher markup than, say, the median firm, but isn't it going to be the same as the average firm? I mean, I'm not getting, I mean, isn't the total industry equal to the sum of all the firms?
The sum, but the sum is going to weight the bigger firms more. That's not the same as averaging, right? So taking the sum in the numerator and the sum in the denominator is not the same as forming this ratio for each firm and then adding the ratio up. What's the difference? This one weights the big firms more.
Okay.
So it's not the average firm markup. It's add the numerator, add the denominator, total revenue for the industry, total cost for the industry. That gives you a different answer. And it's one that differs systematically the more data you have.
Right. And that's because there's going to be, there's going to be some winner take most effects that there's a few people who are kind of pulling away. Yeah,
exactly. Winner take most. And the winner happens to be the person who's got these really low costs and charges a big markup.
Right.
Okay. The empirical evidence of this supports the model. This is evidence from De Loker, Eekhout, and Unger. This red line here is something like our industry markup, where they're weighting big firms by more. These other lines, they're different ways of measuring firm markups, but they're essentially averaging across the firms. They're more disaggregated. And what they find is that 2/3 of the rise in markups over the last few decades comes from this cross-firm aggregation effect, from big markup firms getting bigger. I'll point out, I don't have time to lead you through this entirely. There's a markup dispute that some say that markups are counter-cyclical. That's really important to these new Keynesian models that central banks use. They kind of rely on that assumption. These guys measure at the firm level. Then Ramey and Nicarta came along recently and said, no, they're not. They're not counter-cyclical at all. These guys are arguing and saying that each other is wrong. We're going to say, actually, you could both be right. So if recessions are times when demand falls, but demand variance, importantly, goes up, then both of these facts may be true. And the reason is that when if the recession has more uncertainty about demand, higher variance, more variance creates more scope for covariance. Remember, the covariance between prices and quantities is where that gap between the product markup and the firm markup came from. And so that gap can get wider. There can be more scope for high data firms to produce lots of goods that are way more valuable than other goods in a setting where demand variance is really big than if demand is pretty much known and data is not that useful because, well, you know, there's just not a heck of a lot of uncertainty. Okay, so with lots of uncertainty, the high data firms outperform by a lot more. And that means that their firm markups may be varying more than the product markups. Okay, so that's it. We started from a simple premise, which is firms use data to predict what it is that customers want. It might also be predicting their costs, but they're predicting something that's uncertain. Data is used for more accurate predictions. And we started from the premise that firms prefer higher profits, that should be uncontroversial, but lower risk. And so data does create returns of scale, which prompts high data, high markup firms to grow bigger. And that does look like more market power. But data also reduces risk and it allocates production more efficiently, right? But essentially firms here are using data to give us what we want more of. The problem is this good and this bad parts, they're not separate forces, right? We'd like to be able to strip out the good parts and shut down the bad parts, but it is the efficiency gains that make firms want to grow, right? These both come from a reduction in uncertainty. So we got some unexpected predictions. I didn't expect to get setting out. I wasn't intending to write a paper about the aggregation effects of markup measurement, but it sort of dropped out here. And firm and industry markups are diverging, and one seems to be countercyclical and the other not. And all this stuff is supported by the data, and people are measuring this stuff are kind of having disputes that need not be disputes because maybe they're all right. So the key here is that data is really a technology to reduce uncertainty, right? These new data technologies, AI, machine learning, these are prediction technologies. These are about trying to make more accurate predictions to lower that conditional variance, lower that forecast error. And so we can't study data and ignore risk, because reducing uncertainty interacts with market competition in surprising ways.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Laura. We do have some questions. Let me take my prerogative and ask one first. So here the data is used to change some of the production decisions. I think possibly another work, but you could just speculate. You could also have some companies invest more in data gathering and be better at it, and others worse at it. There does seem to be some evidence that there's a lot of heterogeneity on that dimension as well. Maybe you could just say a little bit about how you expect the results to vary as you invested in data gathering itself.
So I would think of that as there's another stage at the beginning of this model, right? And the first stage is we decide how much data to get. And there must be some differences between us initially that might cause us to gather different amounts of data. Once we have that answer, how much data do we want to get? There's the next question of how do we now compete in a world where firms compete in this way? This is the correct answer to that question. Or put differently, if I wrote your enhanced model where we first choose data or choose data gathering technologies, I would solve it by backwards induction. I would start by saying, well, suppose we've got this much data. How do we then solve this market competition game? And I get some expected utility from that model, and I'd use that as the payoff function when I decide how much data do I want to gather, right? So this is still the correct answer to the continuation question, to the second half of that model that you have in mind.
As you note, by backward induction or you can think of it, there's going to be some types of firms where data is going to be more valuable. If you have more different products, or if you have more uncertainty in your markets, you're going to want to invest more. Maybe there's even a positive feedback there that you then expand to more different categories if you have better data gathering. Does that sound right?
Absolutely. So I would expect firms that are more specialized actually to want to gather more data. And the firm that does a little bit of everything, it's kind of hedged its risk by being diversified, right? So it's the firm that has, all its eggs in one basket, that has staked its reputation on outstanding white shirts and build a big factory just to produce these beautiful white shirts, that really needs to make sure that there is a good, robust, long-lasting market for those white shirts.
Okay. Or I guess I was thinking that a firm that had a lot of different products would reallocate capital and capacity across products based on the data that it got. And so it had more scope to invest in areas that were doing well.
So once I've built my white shirt factory, then maybe my use for data is less, because now I've committed. But up front, I'd really like to know, make sure that I've researched that market well. So I think you're right. There would be a difference between the initial value of data and the value of data on an ongoing basis in a dynamic world.
So I encourage people to put questions in the Q&A. Let me read a few here. Well, let's see. So Janice Mendel asks, how will we reduce, so this is a very philosophical question, how we reduce the risk of pushing society too far in the direction of selling socks at the expense of data, or us, in other words. I guess there's a literature on that there are costs to data gathering aside from its use in affecting marginal costs. Right. Is that something that you've thought much about?
So,
cost to society.
There is a welfare benefit here of data. And so, we
to the consumers,
to consumers, absolutely, right? We're getting more of the socks, the comfy socks we like to wear, the color shirts that that we want to have, or the electric cars that we do or do not want to drive, and we're so this isn't a world in which data is. I think that worldview that maybe data is wasteful comes about because there are firms that are using data to grab a larger slice of the pie, right? Somebody's going to go buy a white shirt, and then I'm going to target them with an ad to make sure they buy my white shirt and not your white shirt, right? And that's a world where data is probably not creating social value. You could build that in. That would be an extension to this model. I have some other work that thinks about data as business. I'd call that business stealing, right? And I think there is a lot of that that's going on, but I think we have to measure it, right? Not all of it's business stealing. Not all of it's for quite as, socially beneficial purposes I've described here, as, doing the right thing for consumers. There's a mix between the two. And I think ultimately, I'm not sure that's a philosophical question. I think it's a measurement question, but it's a measurement question that we're going to need some frameworks to help, right? We can't measure utility or welfare directly. We can't take a ruler to social well-being. We're going to need some models that guide that measurement. And so this is a piece of that puzzle, but not the whole thing.
Yeah. So I could see that you could extend the model to have some ways that data is more zero sum across companies, or also for a consumer, if they know my price perfectly, that my willingness to pay perfectly, they could extract more value, and maybe that would reduce my consumer welfare.
Yeah. So one of the things you might have, if we had that, I was talking about that strategic uncertainty that I rolled out. If we now bring that back in, I don't know what you're going to do. I might get data just trying to forecast what you're going to do, right? And that's probably not so socially beneficial. So there are different ways that we could think about other sorts of data I think are really interesting. And, I hope I made clear, this is a very simple, first pass at doing this and seeing what some of the basic forces are at work. But I love these other sort of directions as future directions for work.
Okay, here's some other future directions. Daniel Rock asks, have you thought about backing out the relative contribution of risk and markups using volatility in securities markets?
Out the risk and markups. Okay, got it. Right. Yes. I have some structural estimation and finance models where we are using moments, including the volatility of asset markets, to try to back out, the value of data in a world where there's also market power. It's got a lot of similarities to this model, but there are some differences as well, and that's a little bit more of a technical discussion that maybe I should have. You can have with that's Daniel Rock. Not everybody wants to hear. Over at Wharton.
Let's see. Here's I think somewhat related questions, not to each other. So there's this question about data being shared or people knowing about other data. One question from Maria Savona is, how do we create incentives for firms to share data for public purposes? And sort of maybe related, but you can decide, is would it be beneficial for some products to be released as open source so costs can be reduced as the volume was increasing faster? And if they had data, would they be able to do that more rapidly?
Okay. My model as written doesn't speak to any of these things, but let me push the boundaries a little bit. In a world where there were some aggregate shocks, so this, our valuation for white shirts wasn't just for Erik's white shirt versus my white shirt, but for all white shirts, then Erik's data would be, useful to me and vice versa. And given that more data helps firms produce more efficiently, there would certainly be a value in getting us to swap our data. We might want to do that individually, but we might not want to do it quite as much as, let's say, a social planner would like for us to do. So, here everybody just had everybody else's data. So we'd already just assumed perfect information sharing. Obviously, that doesn't happen in the real world. Once you start moving away from that, then we can start thinking about, what are the
wouldn't it be? Isn't it pretty clear there'd be benefits to the social planner and to consumers to have data sharing relative to if they didn't, or maybe unless there's some kind of innovation.
Right. So you and I might benefit, right? There is some private incentive to share data, right? If we're in a world with 15 other firms, you and I might write a side contract that says, okay, I'll tell you everything I know if you tell me everything you know. Right. And so that's not absent from private incentives, but we might not do it as much as we should, because I understand that when I give you my data, you also will reduce my market power, right? And so that's what creates the gap between the two.
All right. Here's a little bit of a long question from Bruno Pellegrino. I just stuck it in the direct message to you as well, but I'm going to read it. See if you can parse all of it as I say it. Okay. You're imposing a hedonic linear demand system. One of its properties is that the more productive, i.e. lower marginal cost firms end up charging higher markups. There's no perfect cost price pass through. We know that this fact holds up well in the data, at least for manufacturing companies, but how important is this mechanism in driving the relationship between data and markups? Is it correct to say that imperfect pass-through is an important part of the story?
The extent, yes, because the extent to pass through here depends on data. If you want H, is that pass through? If that H term that depended on data and market power, if that thing were 1, then it would be true that every time we reduced marginal cost, there would be an equivalent reduction in the price. And so this theory is about why firms might not want to do that. They don't want to do that because they want to get compensated for the risk that when I decide to build a more valuable factory, I don't do that for zero profit, right? I have to take on a lot of risk and putting all that money up front, not knowing what the revenues will be. I'm only going to do that if the stream of profits that I expect to get is enough to compensate me for the risk of making that. So that's saying, sure, I'll decrease my cost, but I'm not going to pass all of that through to the consumers, because if I did, I would be bearing risk for no return. And who does that, right? So yeah, this is about imperfect pass-through, and it's got a reason for imperfect pass-through, which is compensation for risk and market power. Either one of those creates imperfect pass-through.
Okay. And here's one from Marshall Reinsdorf. Although data increases welfare by increasing the production of highly demanded varieties, could data also make it more attractive to increase product differentiation as a way of reducing competition? Yeah.
Okay, so this is a short talk. If we had more time, I would show you that we could use this model. Remember, I fixed the attributes of a good. I said, you can produce this good or not, but a good has these attributes. I could let a firm choose those attributes, right? So that means they could move to a location in the product space. And they and when they can make that choice, they do move to an area in the product space that's got less competition. So exactly that happens in that extension of the model. So that's spot on.
Okay, great. And we're just about out of time. So let me just ask, I and Ornell asked a short question, which I'll give you a chance to elaborate on a little bit more, which is, why would I buy, or would I buy more data if I doubt the precision of my forecast? And I guess my broadened version of that is, this model would work well in any period in the 1850s or 1950s or today. Are there ways that you see the technology changing more recently that sort of, well, obviously people are thinking about it more, but are there characteristics now that are different, or is it you model it just as, I think, is more and more precision, but do you want to elaborate on the nature of the information technology?
Sure. I mean, I think the technological breakthroughs we've seen in the use of big data really make this, sure, firms have always collected information, maybe just informally. Maybe the shopkeeper, knows the local residents and that they, buy beer on Friday afternoons and, cheese on Tuesday mornings, right? And that is a form of data collection, right?
Right.
But we've been able to systematize that and extract more insights from the data that people have in a way that's really accelerated this, and so it's reduced that variance a lot more, right? And so I think this effect of uncertainty and wanting compensation for undertaking risky activities and using information to reduce the risk of what we do is absolutely always been present. But recent technologies have supercharged our ability to do that.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Laura. That was terrific. Lots to do there, and also a nice framework for building more in this area that is certainly becoming more and more important. So thanks very much. Have a round of applause for Laura, virtual.
Thank you, everybody who put in questions. That makes it a lot more interesting. Appreciate it.
And in a couple of weeks, we've got S-DEL Mullainathan. He's going to be speaking about algorithmic behavioral science and automated discovery of human biases. We think this is going to be our first in-person seminar of the year. So I hope that will all work, but we'll also stream it so all of you can join via video as well. So thanks very much, and hopefully see most of you on the 15th. Is it the 15th? Yes, November 15th. So we'll see you then. Thanks again, Laura. See ya.